To them, he was just an old man, a relic of a forgotten time, standing silently in the sterile, white hallway of the hospital. His name was Elias, and his world had shrunk to the size of this room, to the rhythmic, heartbreaking beep of the heart monitor that was the only metronome for his wife Eleanor's final moments. He held her hand, a hand he had held for 50 years, through joy and sorrow, through hardship and peace. The skin was paper-thin now, a delicate map of their shared life, and his thumb traced the familiar lines, as if trying to memorize them one last time before they were gone forever. The air in the room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the unspoken weight of departure. Silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket, was broken only by the machine's clinical sigh and Eleanor's shallow breaths. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile tide going out for the last time, and felt his own breath hitch in unison. This was the precipice, the final, sacred moment where a lifetime of love was supposed to be honored, witnessed, and held in gentle reverence. But they were not there. His phone, a simple, outdated thing, buzzed with a cold, intrusive vibration against the worn fabric of his trousers. He knew, even before he looked, what it would say. Releasing Eleanor's hand for a moment that felt like a betrayal, he pulled it out. The screen glowed with a message from his daughter, Clara. "So sorry, Dad. Marcus's promotion party is tonight. It's a huge deal for his career. We just can't miss it. He's finally getting everything he's worked for. We'll try to swing by the hospital tomorrow." He read the words once, then twice. Each one was a small, sharp icicle piercing the fragile warmth he was trying to preserve in this room. They weren't coming. Her husband's promotion, a step up a corporate ladder he didn't understand or care for, was more important than her mother's final breath. The injustice of it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. He didn't feel anger, not yet, just a profound, hollow ache that settled deep in his bones, a coldness the thin hospital blanket couldn't touch. He looked from the glowing screen to Eleanor's face, serene and unknowing. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a slow path through the lines on his own weathered cheek. It wasn't for himself that he cried, but for her, for the woman who had poured her entire life into raising a daughter who would, at the very end, choose a celebration of ambition over a vigil of love. He didn't reply to the text. What was there to say? He simply switched the phone off, severing the connection to that other world, a world of noise and striving that had no place here. Here, in the quiet sanctity of this room, only one thing mattered. He took Eleanor's hand again, holding it tightly, as if his grip alone could anchor her to this world. "I'm here, my love," he whispered, his voice raspy with unshed tears. "I'm right here." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against her joined hands, and began to speak to her, recounting the day they first met, the rain-slicked afternoon under the green awning of a bookstore. He spoke of their first dance, the birth of their daughter, the simple, profound beauty of their ordinary life. He poured a half-century of memories into the stillness of the room, a final, desperate offering. As he spoke, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor began to slow, each space between the sounds stretching into an eternity. He felt the faint pressure of her hand relax in his. And then the beep was replaced by a single, unending tone. It was a sound that cleaved his life in two. Before and after, the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was empty, utterly, devastatingly empty. He sat there in the echoing void, holding the hand of the woman who was his everything, utterly and completely alone. To the world, he was just an old man. To the nurses who would eventually come in with practiced sympathy, he was just another grieving husband. But what they didn't know, what his daughter and her arrogant husband didn't know, was that this quiet, unassuming man had once built worlds with his mind and held the futures of thousands in his hands. They had dismissed him, but they had no idea who they had just abandoned. Elias lived in a small, unassuming house on a tree-lined street, a house that had been his and Eleanor's for nearly all of their 50 years together. It was a place built not of brick and mortar, but of shared moments and accumulated love. Every object held a story. The worn armchair in the living room was where he had read to Clara as a child, her small head resting on his chest. The faint scratches on the wooden floor were from a Christmas, when they had bought her a puppy that grew into a loyal, lumbering companion. The garden in the back, now slightly overgrown, was Eleanor's pride and joy, a riot of color and life that she had tended with patient, loving hands. This house was a sanctuary, a living museum of a life well lived, a life that felt a million miles away from the cold, sterile ambition of his daughter and her husband, Marcus. In stark contrast, their world was one of polished steel and minimalist design, a high-rise apartment with panoramic city views that felt more like a corporate showroom than a home. Their conversations, on the rare occasions Elias was invited over, were a whirlwind of acronyms, stock prices, and strategic career moves. Marcus, in particular, seemed to personify this world. He was a man perpetually in motion, his eyes always darting to his phone, his mind always on the next rung of the ladder. He treated Elias with a kind of patronizing civility, the way one might treat a harmless but slightly embarrassing elderly relative. He called him champ or old-timer, his words coated in a thin veneer of respect that failed to hide the deep-seated condescension beneath. Marcus was a rising star at a massive tech conglomerate called Innovate Dynamics, a company known for its aggressive market strategies and cutting-edge technology. To Marcus, Elias was a relic, a former low-level clerk who had retired into a life of quiet obscurity. He couldn't comprehend a life not defined by title or net worth. The idea that Elias might have a history, a past that didn't involve stocking shelves or filing papers, was beyond the scope of his imagination. But Elias did have a past. It was a past he kept locked away, buried under decades of deliberate anonymity. The only visible hint was a small, faded tattoo on the inside of his left forearm, a symbol he always kept hidden beneath the sleeve of his shirt. It was a stylized phoenix, its wings intertwined with complex gear, a relic from a different life, a different man. He had chosen this quiet existence, had shed his former identity as deliberately as a snake sheds its skin. He had wanted nothing more than to be Eleanor's husband and Clara's father, to live a simple, unnoticed life. For 50 years he had succeeded. He had found profound joy in the ordinary, a peace that men like Marcus, forever chasing the next big thing, would never understand. Now, with Eleanor gone, the silence in the small house was a deafening roar. The memories that once brought comfort now felt like ghosts, haunting the empty rooms. He would find himself standing in the doorway of her garden, the vibrant colors a painful reminder of her absence. He would pick up a book they had read together, the scent of the old paper bringing a fresh wave of grief. The world felt muted, drained of its color, and the future stretched before him as a vast, gray emptiness. He thought of Clara, of the daughter he had raised, and felt a chasm of disconnect. How had she become so much a part of Marcus's world that she had forgotten the values they had tried to instill in her? The values of family, of loyalty, of showing up when it matters most. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his chest, that Marcus was the architect of this change, that his ambition was a corrosive force that had slowly eaten away at his daughter's heart. He was not a man who sought conflict, but the cold finality of that unanswered text, the image of his wife dying without her daughter by her side, had kindled something within him, a dormant ember that had begun to glow with righteous, unfamiliar heat. He had let the world see him as small for a very long time. Perhaps it was time to remind them that even the quietest man has a story, and some stories are powerful enough to shake the very foundations of the world. The day of the funeral was cold and gray, the sky a weeping blanket of miserable drizzle that seemed to reflect the state of Elias's soul. He stood by the freshly dug earth, a solitary, stoic figure in a simple, dark suit that hung in his closet for years, reserved for weddings and now for this. A handful of old neighbors and a few distant relatives were scattered among the headstones, their expressions a mixture of genuine sorrow and awkward discomfort. Then there was Clara, standing beside her husband, Marcus. She wore an expensive black dress, her face hidden behind a pair of large, fashionable sunglasses, as if to shield herself not from the sun, which was nowhere to be seen, but from the raw, unfiltered grief of the moment. Marcus stood beside her, looking impatient and restless. He checked his watch twice during the short, impersonal eulogy delivered by a somber-faced celebrant who had never known Eleanor, who spoke of her in generic, hollow terms. Marcus's presence felt like a desecration, his crisp, tailored suit and polished shoes an insult to the sacred ground on which they stood. He was a man attending a business obligation, a box to be ticked before moving on to more important matters. Elias watched him from the corner of his eye, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He saw the way Clara leaned into Marcus, seeking comfort not from the memory of her mother, but from the solid, ambitious presence of her husband. He saw the way Marcus whispered something in her ear, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They were a unit, a self-contained world of two, and he was on the outside, looking in, after the final prayer. As a few mourners began to disperse, offering Elias quiet, clumsy condolences, Marcus and Clara approached. "Dad," Clara began, her voice strained, the sunglasses still firmly in place. It was a nice service. The words were empty, meaningless. She couldn't even bring herself to look him in the eye. It was Marcus who took control of the conversation, stepping forward with an air of brisk efficiency. "Elias, we're very sorry for your loss," he said, his tone the same one he probably used for underperforming subordinates. "Eleanor was a great woman, but we really have to get going. I've got a mountain of work to get through before the promotion announcement. It's a game changer for us, you understand." He clapped a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture meant to convey solidarity but which felt dismissive and patronizing. "This promotion, it's the culmination of everything I've been working towards. It solidifies my position as a senior vice president. It's a whole new level." He spoke of his own success at the graveside of the woman his ambition had kept his wife from seeing one last time. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it was breathtaking. Elias said nothing. He simply looked at Marcus, his gaze steady and unwavering. For the first time, a flicker of something other than grief stirred within him. It was a cold, hard anger, sharp and clear as glass. He looked at his daughter, still hiding behind her glasses, a willing accomplice to this breathtaking disrespect. "She waited for you," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that cut through the damp air. "She kept asking for you." Clara flinched, a small, almost invisible reaction. But Marcus just sighed, a sound of weary impatience. "Look, we feel terrible about that. We really do," he said. "But you have to be realistic. My career provides for her. For us, this event was mandatory. It was about securing our future. It was a final straw. The casual dismissal of Eleanor's final wish, framed as a practical necessity for the very daughter she had given everything for." Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The man he was, the quiet, humble retiree, seemed to recede, and in his place stood someone else, someone colder, someone more resolute. He gave a single, slow nod. "I see," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. He turned his back on them then, and walked towards a waiting car, leaving them standing by the grave. He didn't look back. The public challenge had been laid down, not with a shout, but with a condescending pat on the shoulder. The humiliation was complete. In their eyes, he was nothing, a harmless old man to be pitied and managed. They had no idea of the storm they had just awakened. They had judged him on his quiet life, but they knew nothing of the world he had left behind or the power he still held. The drive home was a blur. The quiet house felt colder, emptier than ever before. But amidst the grief, a new feeling was taking root. Determination. The promise he had made to himself, to live a quiet life, had been contingent on one thing, the happiness and safety of his family. But what does a man do when that very family is the source of the desecration of his most sacred vows? He had built his life on a foundation of love and honor for Eleanor. They had trampled on that foundation, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he could not let that stand. A week passed, a blur of suffocating silence and sharp-edged memories. Elias moved through the empty house like a ghost, the routines of his life with Eleanor now hollowed-out rituals. He made 2 cups of coffee in the morning out of habit, only to pour one down the sink. He found himself turning to share a thought with her, the words dying in his throat as he remembered she wasn't there. The grief was a constant companion, a physical presence in every room. But alongside the grief, the cold flame of resolve that had been kindled at the funeral was growing, fueled by the echoing arrogance of Marcus's words. He had to do something, not for revenge, not in anger, but for Eleanor, to honor the memory of a life they had so casually dismissed. He knew he couldn't reach Clara through words. She was too insulated by Marcus's ambition. To get to her, to make her see the magnitude of what she had lost, he would have to enter their world. He would have to go to the heart of the beast, innovate dynamics. He put on his best, simple clothes, clean trousers, a pressed shirt, a warm but respectable jacket. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw just an old man, his face a road map of grief. It was the perfect disguise. He took a bus downtown, the city's frantic energy a stark contrast to the quiet stillness of his life. The Innovate Dynamics Tower was a monument to modern arrogance, a shard of glass and steel that pierced the clouds. It was designed to intimidate, to make anyone who approached feel small and insignificant. As he walked toward the grand entrance, he felt the familiar weight of being invisible, the same way he had for years. It was a cloak he had worn willingly, but now it felt different, tactical. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and polished chrome, bustling with young, important-looking people moving with sharp, purposeful strides. A severe-looking woman sat at a massive security desk, her face a mask of bored authority. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes flicking over his simple attire with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm here to see my daughter," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "Clara Jensen." The woman typed the name into her computer. "She's not in our employee directory." Her husband, then, Marcus Jensen. Mr. Jensen is a senior vice president. He has a closed calendar today. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Elias said. "I don't." "Then I'm afraid you can't go up," she said, her tone final. She had already dismissed him, her attention returning to her screen. Elias didn't argue. He simply stood there, waiting. He had learned long ago that stillness can be more powerful than any protest. He found a hard, uncomfortable bench at the edge of the lobby and sat, his hands resting on his knees. He would wait. He watched the flow of people, the endless river of ambition. He saw the subtle hierarchies, the deferential nods given some, the dismissive glances afforded to others. It was a world he knew intimately, not from the bottom as they assumed, but from the very top. He had designed these systems of human striving, had architected the very game they were all so desperately trying to play. Hours passed. The morning rush subsided into midday lull, then swelled again with the lunch crowd. He sat, unmoving, a statue of quiet patience. It was then that Marcus and Clara emerged from the elevators, laughing at something Marcus had said. They were heading for the exit, likely on their way to a celebratory lunch. Marcus saw him first. His face would have been alight with cheerful arrogance, darkened into a thunderous scowl. He strode over to Elias, his expensive shoes clicking angrily on the marble floor. Clara followed, her face a mixture of surprise and acute embarrassment. "What in the world are you doing here?" Marcus hissed, his voice low but vibrating with fury. "This is my place of work. You can't just show up here." "I wanted to talk to Clara," Elias said simply. "This is not the time or the place," Marcus snapped, his face reddening. He was making a scene, drawing the attention of the security guards and the people passing by. "You're embarrassing us. Look at you. You don't belong here. This is a place for important people, for winners. Go home, old man." He gestured dismissively, as if shooing away a stray animal. Two burly security guards began to approach, sensing the conflict. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Jensen?" one asked. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This man is harassing me. Please escort him from the building." As one of the guards took Elias's arm, his jacket sleeve rolled up for just a second, revealing the faded tattoo on his forearm, the phoenix and the gear. At that exact moment, a young man, an intern named Alex, was walking by with a stack of documents. He was a history buff, fascinated by the origins of the company he was so proud to work for. His eyes happened to fall on Elias's arm, and he stopped dead in his tracks. He had seen that symbol before, not in person, but in a grainy old photograph in the company archives, in a file labeled Founders. It was on the arm of a young, brilliant man named Elias Vance, the legendary reclusive genius who had started the company and then vanished from public life decades ago. A man most people thought was a myth. Alex looked from the faded tattoo on the old man's arm to his weary, grief-stricken face. His mind reeled. It couldn't be. Could it? The security guard's grip was firm, but not overly aggressive. Elias didn't resist. He allowed himself to be led towards the revolving glass doors, the monument of his own creation. He could feel Marcus's triumphant, scornful gaze on his back. He could feel his daughter's shame, a palpable wave of it washing over the marble lobby. He had become a problem to be removed, a piece of trash to be swept out of sight. The public humiliation was now absolute, witnessed by the very people his son-in-law was so desperate to impress. But as he was being pushed toward the exit, something else was happening. The young intern, Alex, stood frozen for a moment, the documents in his hands forgotten. His heart was hammering in his chest. That symbol, it was unmistakable. He had spent weeks in the digital archives, obsessed with the almost mythical origin story of Innovate Dynamics. The official history was that it was founded by a board of directors, but the whispers, the legends among the old-timers, spoke of a single visionary founder, Elias Vance, a man who designed the core Phoenix operating system and the Aegis hardware that the entire company's fortune was built upon before walking away from it all, leaving it in the hands of his trusted partner, a man named Arthur Sterling, the current reclusive CEO. The archives contained only one clear photo of Vance from that era, a black and white shot of a young man with intense eyes, sleeves rolled up, leaning over a primitive circuit board. On his forearm was a tattoo, a phoenix intertwined with a gear. The company logo was a sanitized, corporate version of it, but this old man's tattoo was the original, the raw, faded source. Alex's mind raced. Could this quiet, poorly dressed old man being thrown out of the lobby actually be the legendary Elias Vance? The thought seemed absurd, impossible. Yet, the evidence was right there on his skin. Alex looked over at Marcus Jensen, puffed up with self-importance, preening after his perceived victory. He saw the fear and embarrassment on Clara Jensen's face. He saw the cold, dismissive look from the security chief, and he felt a surge of indignation. If this man was who he thought he was, then what was happening was not just an injustice. It was a blasphemy. Acting on an instinct he didn't fully understand, Alex made a decision. He dropped the files he was carrying, creating a clatter that drew a few eyes. As he bent to pick them up, he discreetly pulled out his phone. He had Arthur Sterling's direct office number. It was a number given only to a handful of senior executives, a number he had only because he was assisting Sterling's own executive assistant with a historical project. To call was an insane risk. It could get him fired on the spot. But the image of the old man's dignified, sorrowful face as he was being manhandled was too much to bear. His fingers trembled as he found the number and pressed call. A stern, professional voice answered immediately. Sterling's office. "My name is Alex," he stammered, keeping his voice low. "I'm an intern. I know this is a breach of protocol, a serious one, but you need to tell Mr. Sterling something. It's about Elias Vance. I think he's in the lobby, and he's being removed by security." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Are you certain?" the voice asked, all traces of boredom gone, replaced by a sudden electric urgency. "I saw the tattoo," Alex whispered. "The Phoenix. It's him." The line went silent for a heartbeat, and then, "Stay where you are. Keep eyes on him. The chairman is on his. Way down. Do not let that man leave the building." The line went dead. Alex's blood ran cold. The chairman, Arthur Sterling himself. He was coming down. Alex looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The security guards had just pushed Elias through the final glass door and were standing on the plaza outside, making sure he left the premises. Elias stood there for a moment, a frail figure against the backdrop of the monolithic tower, then slowly began to walk away. "Stop!" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. He ran toward the doors, surprising the guards. "You can't let him leave. That's an order from the chairman's office." The guards looked at him, a skinny intern, with disbelief. "An order from who?" one of them scoffed. But before Alex could answer, the entire atmosphere of the lobby shifted. A hush fell over the bustling space. The express elevator, the one reserved for the executive floor, dinged, and the polished steel doors slid open. The moment that followed would be seared into the memory of everyone present. The party was in full swing. Innovate Dynamics had rented out the most exclusive ballroom in the city to celebrate its new roster of senior vice presidents, and Marcus Jensen was the undisputed star of the evening. The room was a glittering spectacle of corporate success, filled with the clinking of champagne glasses, the low thrum of self-congratulatory chatter, and the soft strains of a live jazz trio. Marcus stood at the center of it all, a king holding court. He was magnetic, his laughter loud, his gestures expansive. He moved through the crowd with an easy confidence, his hand possessively on the small of Clara's back. She stood beside him, a perfect accessory in a shimmering gown, her smile bright but her eyes betraying a lingering shadow of the day's earlier mortification. She had been furious with her father, embarrassed by his sudden, inexplicable appearance. Marcus had smoothed it over, of course, spinning the story to his colleagues as the sad, confused actions of an old man addled by grief. It was a lie, and she knew it, but she allowed it to stand, the truth too uncomfortable to confront. Now it was time for the speeches. The CEO, Arthur Sterling, was famously reclusive and never attended such events, so the honor of introducing the new VPs fell to the chief operating officer. One by one, they were called to the stage to say a few words. When Marcus's name was announced, the applause was the loudest. He practically bounded onto the small stage, his face flushed with triumph. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet room. "Wow!" he began, beaming. "What a night. I see so many brilliant faces out there tonight, the people who make Innovate Dynamics the powerhouse that it is." He launched into a speech dripping with false humility and buzzword-laden platitudes. He thanked his teams, his mentors, the board. "It's all about pushing the envelope," he declared, "about leveraging synergy and disrupting the paradigm." Elias was there. He stood at the very back of the ballroom, near the service entrance, a silent, unnoticed specter. The young intern, Alex, had intercepted him on the plaza, babbling about the chairman and a phone call. Elias had simply nodded, a strange placidness settling over him, and allowed the now flustered security guards to escort him not out, but up to a waiting area and then, at his quiet request, to the back of this very ballroom. He wanted to see this. He wanted to witness the pinnacle of the world that had stolen his daughter, to see the man who had desecrated his wife's memory in his moment of ultimate glory. As Marcus continued his smug monologue, the grand double doors at the main entrance to the ballroom swung open. No one noticed at first, except for Elias. The jazz trio faltered, then fell silent. A new presence had entered the room, a presence so heavy with authority that it seemed to suck the very air out of space. Arthur Sterling, the chairman and CEO of Innovate Dynamics, a man who hadn't been seen at a public company event in over a decade, strode into the room. He was an older man himself, with a mane of white hair and eyes that held the sharp, penetrating intelligence of a lifelong power player. He was not alone. Flanking him were the 4 other members of the executive board, the most powerful people in the corporation, all of them looking grim and resolute. The chatter in the room died instantly. Champagne glasses were lowered. Every head turned toward the entrance. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening. Marcus, on stage, faltered mid-sentence. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, at the procession. He had never even been in the same room as Arthur Sterling before. The CEO and the board ignored everyone. They ignored the COO. They ignored the other VPs. And they walked right past the stage where Marcus stood, frozen. Their eyes scanned the crowd, searching. Then Sterling saw him, his gaze locked onto the quiet, unassuming old man standing by the service entrance. A look of profound, almost reverent recognition washed over the powerful CEO's face. The entire board stopped, their movements synchronized and turned as one, in front of the entire glittering assembly of Innovate Dynamics top talent. Arthur Sterling and his board directors walked directly toward the man they knew as Elias Vance. They bypassed the star of the evening, Marcus Jensen, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture, and approached the man he called a harmless old-timer with the deference one would afford a king. The power dynamic of the room didn't just shift. It shattered into a million pieces. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a thick, ringing void where just moments before there had been celebration. Every eye was fixed on the unbelievable scene unfolding at the back of the room. Arthur Sterling, a titan of industry, a man whose name was whispered with awe, stood before the quiet, simply dressed old man. The members of the board fanned out behind him, forming a silent, respectful semicircle. Marcus was still on the stage, microphone in hand, a statue of pure shock. His triumphant speech was forgotten, his moment of glory utterly annihilated. Clara stood near the front, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying comprehension. "Elias," Arthur Sterling said, his voice, though not loud, carrying to every corner of the silent room. It was a voice accustomed to absolute command, yet now it was filled with a deep, unmistakable reverence. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Elias simply nodded, his face impassive, his gaze steady. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "For those of you who do not know," Sterling continued, turning slightly to address the stunned audience, but his focus remaining on Elias. "This man is the reason every single one of us is in this room tonight. You work for a company built on his genius. You trade in a currency of innovation that he minted." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your badges say Innovate Dynamics, but that name is a corporate fiction, a placeholder for the true name, the original name, the Vance Sterling Initiative." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The name Vance was a legend, a myth from the company's founding days. "This is Elias Vance," Sterling declared, his voice ringing with authority and something else, a deep, abiding loyalty. "He is not just a founder. He is the founder, the architect, the man who, in a small garage, with nothing but his mind and a soldering iron, created the Phoenix core technology that remains the bedrock of our entire enterprise to this day." He turned back to Elias, his expression softening. 30 years ago, after a personal tragedy, Elias decided to walk away. He wanted a quiet life. He left the company in my hands, asking for nothing but anonymity. He could have been a billionaire 1,000 times over. Instead, he wanted peace. He wanted a life with the woman he loved. At the mention of Eleanor, a flicker of pain crossed Elias's face, the first emotion he had shown. Clara felt it like a physical blow, the color draining from her face. Her husband's promotion, her mother's last moments, the pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Sterling's monologue continued. Each were a hammer blow to reality they all thought they knew. He signed over his controlling interest of the board, but with one single, non-negotiable clause in the founding charter. A clause I have honored for 3 decades. The Vance Protocol. It states that he, Elias Vance, retains ultimate moral authority, that he can, at any time, for any reason he deems just, reclaim his position, overrule any decision, and assume full command of this company, a power he has never, ever used. Sterling's gaze hardened as he swept across the room, finally letting it land on the frozen figure of Marcus Jensen on the stage. "It has come to my attention," he said, his voice turning to ice, "that this man, this legend, who wanted nothing from us but to be left alone, was not only disrespected today, but was humiliated. He was cast out from the building that he built by people who owe their very careers to his silent genius. He was dismissed and belittled by a man who, in his unbridled arrogance, failed to recognize the face of his own creator. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and lethal. The entire room now stared at Marcus, who looked as if he had been turned to stone. His face was a ghastly shade of white, his smug confidence replaced by sheer, primal terror. The story was complete. The quiet, unassuming old man was not a clerk, not a janitor, not a relic. He was a king, returned from a self-imposed exile, and his quiet dignity had been violated. The reveal was not just a shift in power, it was a judgment. The aftermath of Arthur Sterling's revelation was a silence, so profound it felt like a physical force. No one moved. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to crackle with the sheer, unadulterated shock of it all. All the ambition, the backslapping camaraderie, the competitive energy of the evening had evaporated, replaced by a single, unifying emotion: awe, and for some, a chilling, gut-wrenching dread. Marcus Jensen stood on the stage as if frozen in time, the microphone slipping from his limp fingers and thudding softly on the podium. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on Elias, the man he had derided, the man he had ordered to be thrown out. In that moment, he saw his entire life, his carefully constructed career, his meteoric rise, turn to ash. He had not just insulted his father-in-law. He had committed a cardinal sin against the living deity of his corporate religion. He had blasphemed against the founder, his promotion. The very event that had cost his wife her mother's final moments now felt like a sick, tragic joke. It was a monument to his own hubris, and the architect of that hubris was now watching it crumble before his very eyes. Closer to the front, Clara was imploding. The sound in the room may have been silence, but in her ears, it was a roaring inferno. Her father, the quiet, simple man she had grown distant from, the man she had allowed her husband to mock, the man she had abandoned in his darkest hour for a party, was this towering figure of legend. The memories flooded back in a painful, chaotic rush. Her father teaching her to read, helping her with complex math homework she thought was impossible, explaining the world in ways that were both simple and profound. She had mistaken his humility for mediocrity. She had traded the unconditional love of a king for the conditional approval of a court jester. The weight of her misjudgment was crushing, a physical pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. The sunglasses she had worn at the funeral, the expensive dress she wore now. It was all a costume, a cheap facade she had worn to fit into a world that, it turned out, her father had built and discarded. She looked at her husband on the stage, no longer seeing a charismatic winner, but a small, petty man, hollowed out by his own ambition. And she looked at her father, standing at the back of the room, not with triumph, but with a deep, unshakable sorrow in his eyes. He wasn't looking at the board or the CEO or the stunned crowd. He was looking at her, and in his gaze, she saw the full extent of what she had lost. It wasn't just her mother. It was her own honor. Arthur Sterling and the board members remained silent, their attention fixed solely on Elias. They were waiting. The entire corporation, the future of every person in that room, hung on the next words of the man they had wronged. The Vance Protocol. He could undo it all. He could fire Marcus with a single word. He could dissolve the board. He could dismantle the company and scatter it to the winds if he so chose. The power he held was absolute. The antagonists, Marcus and by extension Clara, were shamed into a silence more profound than any shouting match could ever be. Their world had been unmade, their ignorance laid bare for all to see. The honor of the quiet hero had been restored, not by his own hand, but by the undeniable truth of his past, a truth that arrived with the force of a tidal wave, sweeping away all the lies and pretenses in its path. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What would he do? What would justice look like? What did the quiet king demand of the subjects who had failed him so profoundly? Elias looked across the silent, cavernous ballroom, his gaze passing over the shocked faces, over the powerful men who now deferred to him, over the terrified shell man who was his son-in-law. His eyes finally rested on his daughter, Clara. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time in years, not as a successful wife of an executive, but as the little girl who had lost her way. He saw the genuine horror and regret etched on her face, a mask of grief far more real than the one she had worn at the funeral. In that moment, he felt no anger, no desire for retribution, only a vast cavernous sorrow. The victory felt hollow, the vindication meaningless. Restoring his honor in their eyes meant nothing when the one person whose opinion had ever truly mattered was gone. None of this would bring Eleanor back. None of this would rewind the clock and put Clara at her mother's bedside. Arthur Sterling took a half-step forward, his voice low and respectful, intended only for Elias, but heard by all in the pin-drop silence. "Elias, what are your orders? The Vance Protocol is clear. Your word is law." The entire room held its breath. Marcus visibly trembled on the stage, a man awaiting his own execution. He had built his identity on his status within this company, and he knew that Elias now held the power to strip him of it entirely, to erase him from the corporate landscape, to make him a pariah. Elias drew a slow breath. He turned his gaze from his daughter to Arthur. Sterling, the friend he had trusted to carry on his legacy. "There are no orders, Arthur," he said, his voice quiet but firm, imbued with a natural authority that needed no title. He then looked towards Marcus, not with contempt, but with profound, weary disappointment that was somehow more devastating. "You can keep your promotion," he said, the words falling like stones into the silent pool of the room. "You can keep your title. You can keep your ambition." He paused, letting the weight of his final judgment settle. "You've already lost everything that matters." With that, he said nothing more to them. He gave a final, small, almost imperceptible nod to Arthur Sterling, a gesture of dismissal, of conclusion. Then he turned his back on the glittering ballroom, on the shattered career of his son-in-law, on the tear-streaked face of his daughter, and on the empire he had built. He walked toward the service exit, his steps unhurried, his back straight. He didn't look back. He simply left. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving a room full of the most powerful people in the city in a state of stunned paralysis. He had come not to reclaim his kingdom, but to make a point, and he had. His vindication was not in their shock or their fear. It was in his own quiet departure. He had shown them the man they had disrespected, and then he had shown them that their world, the world they valued so highly, held no power over him. He remained humble, his honor restored not by taking power, but by walking away from it. He did not need their validation. His worth was not tied to their recognition. His kingdom was the 50 years he'd had with Eleanor, a realm far richer and more meaningful than any corporate empire. As he walked down the quiet service corridor and out onto the street, he felt the immense weight of the past few days begin to lift, replaced by the familiar, aching weight of his grief. But it was a clean grief now, a grief he could carry with honor. He had defended Eleanor's memory. He had held a mirror up to their world. And now he could leave them to the mercy of their own reflections. The walk home through the sleeping city was a long, meditative journey. The towering buildings, once symbols of a world he had abandoned, now seemed small and insignificant. Elias didn't take a taxi or a bus. He walked, feeling the solid pavement beneath his feet, the cool night air on his face. He was grounding himself, reconnecting with the simple, tangible world he had chosen, the world he still chose. Back in the ballroom, the silence eventually broke, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fizzle. Arthur Sterling, without another word, turned and led the board of directors out of the room. Their departure as swift and final as their arrival. The party was over. People began to leave in hushed, awkward groups, avoiding eye contact with Marcus, who remained on the stage for a long time, a man stranded on a desert island of his own making. Clara eventually made her way to him, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. There were no words between them. What could be said? Their marriage, built on a foundation of shared ambition, had been exposed as a house of cards, and had just been blown down by a quiet, righteous wind. Their lives would never be the same. The promotion was now a mark of shame, a constant reminder of their catastrophic failure character. The story of that night would become a legend at Innovate Dynamics, whispered in corridors and retold in hushed tones for years to come. The legend of the humble old man who was secretly the king. But Elias was oblivious to all of this, and he would have been indifferent if he had known. He arrived at his small, quiet house as the first hints of dawn were beginning to streak the eastern sky. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar silence of the house welcoming him like an old friend. It was no longer a suffocating, empty silence. It was a peaceful silence, a silence filled with the lingering presence of a love that could not be tarnished by the outside world. He walked into the living room and picked up the framed photograph from the mantelpiece, the one taken on their wedding day. He looked at Eleanor's young, smiling face, full of hope and love. "I'm home, my love," he whispered to the photograph. He had not taken matters into his own hands for revenge. He had done it to honor her, to affirm the value of the life they had built together, a life of quiet dignity, a life of love. He had proven, in the most dramatic way possible, that their simple world was infinitely more valuable than the loud, glittering, hollow world that had tried to dismiss it. He sat in his worn armchair, the one where he had read to his daughter so many years ago and held the photograph to his chest. He was still a grieving husband in an empty house, but he was at peace. His honor was intact. His love for Eleanor was a fortress that no amount of disrespect could ever breach. The narrative of our lives is not always written in the grand halls of power or celebrated in glittering ballrooms. Sometimes, the most profound stories are lived in the quietest corners of the world. They are stories of integrity, of love that endures, of a quiet strength that asks for nothing and gives everything. What is the true measure of a life? Is it the titles we collect and the wealth we accumulate? Or is it the honor we maintain and the love we protect? Tell us in the comments what you believe truly defines a person's legacy. And for more stories that inspire and remind us of the hidden heroes among us, don't forget to subscribe.